So indeed, what I try to do is to offer the perspective on what it all means, what we're doing in this conference, potentially for decision makers in governments. That's ultimately, I will end with what I'm aiming to do in bringing kind of the results of this conference and other work on climate change and science and religion in my role as a chief scientific advisor to the Dutch Delta Commissioner. So my role is every year to tell the Dutch government, parliament, people, to tell them what they may have missed in their science, which uncertainties and risks they may have overlooked, or they may have over-dramatized. But I don't think there's too much of that, to be honest. That's my personal view. However, playing that role as chief scientific advisor to a government, I am not of the view that members of parliament or ministers or secretaries should just follow the science. While most of my colleagues in this kind of role would do that, and I think it's counterproductive. And I will address some of those elements, and I think this is a really nice follow-on from Mike Hume, what he was saying, and also addressing that weird observation, and we're actually going to write about it together because we made exactly the same observation independently, how underrepresented religion is in science advice to government. And it's mind-blowing in a sense that also the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is hardly devoting words to it, and I have a few examples. I'm interested in how, in this interface between science and public policy, worldviews and spirituality can play a mediating role. How paying attention to the role of emotion, not only in decision-making or behavior, but also in doing science, is very important to get to grips with in order to provide a better interface between science and public policy. Now, I want to start with one example as a little emblem, little story, and that sets the scene for my further talk. This is a result from a project that I've been doing with a couple of postdocs on Southeast Asia and how the science policy interface was working there with respect to climate change, focusing on the rivers. And also studying how the typical Dutch approach with our Delta program, we had the Delta Commission in the 50s and we had the recent Delta Commission, now Delta program and Delta Commissioner, where we have these simulations far into the futures and scenarios and looking at risks, looking 100 years ahead, 200 years ahead. I have to really advise on what the government should prepare for 2300. How that approach of doing this kind of Delta program approach was so easy to export to Vietnam, to Bangladesh, to Myanmar for a little while, but we could not make any inroads as Dutch government, even for free, in Thailand. And this triggered an empirical question. We wanted to really empirically get to an answer or a partial answer to that question of why that obvious science advice. It's logical. You pick a model, you do the calculations, and then you model your whole delta, and then you can plan for the future. And what we found was that in Thailand, that was the only country in that region that we studied that had never been colonized, had the Buddhist kingship model of public administration. When we interviewed people, they were more interested in looking at statistics. They had better data than other countries had. But they were distrustful of models and far futures and the uncertainties. And they didn't have, this is kind of maybe going a little bit too far, but well, we got it published, so there may be something in it. The Dutch Protestant approach to progress, right, is very different from the Thai worldview. And we saw it work out in actual practice in public. So this was just to give you a flavor of how you can have very different informants of how you decide to engineer your water system in this case. I'm highly critical of the capacity of this system to deal with the climate change that's coming, and that's a matter of very interesting discussion. But still, I think it serves as a reminder that science advice should really pay full attention to the societal and religious context. Now, moving to the kind of philosophy of culture that I work in and that I teach also at UCL, and I've been inspired in doing this by a couple of philosophers, is William James, first of all, and then Bruno Latour, in how he picks up through Whitehead William James, on the one hand. On the other hand, very much connected also to the previous talk, Heinrich Rickert, and his very open version of neo-Kantianism, which I think can actually be a naturalism. And this is why I developed, he calls it himself a transcendental empiricism, and I developed that into combining with some elements of Latour into a transcendental naturalism. And Whitney Bauman challenged me to make the link to the new materialisms, which I'm now working on. But just to give you the flavor of the role of religion in connecting to climate change, I think it has to connect to all these different elements of culture. So starting with the science, which is, use Latour's terminology, but that you can use any terminology in a sense, but that's kind of how to make reference to how the world works, and that can be both the natural world and the social world. The importance of how well fiction is able to hold up if you think about the future of the climate. Climate fiction is a very important mode to relate to what may be coming. The dimension of metamorphosis away from a collective capture by consumerism, right? We are collectively in a psychosis, and you can really use that terminology and that analogy to really separately talk about that dimension of culture. The dimension of morality, Latour treats it very much in terms of economics, cost and benefits, and how do you relate to what ought to be done in that sense. But it's, of course, it's more extensive. It's a very important dimension. Who wins? Who loses? Politics, very interesting question, politics, also when I advise on the long term on climate change. People often claim it's not possible to make decision making at a multi-century time scale. Well, politicians are able to get groups behind them if they want so. Politics has also always been decision-making under big uncertainty and also for long time scales. So it's really interesting to study how that can be done, the formation of groups behind those ideas that you need to deal with the long range. The law is another really interesting element, and how you relate to that from all the different other domains in culture for climate change, for instance, both international and national law. So much happening at the administrative law front. Civil law in the Netherlands, we were pioneers in the government being convicted of not having done enough, right, by Friends of the Earth, and it was upheld all levels until the Supreme Court also said yes, for human rights, in this case, was focused as very anthropocentric. For the human rights of the Dutch population, you haven't done enough to deal with climate change. But there's also going to be criminal law. Right, there's in climate fiction, there's Nuremberg trials for fossil fuel CEOs, right? And there's terrorism and people getting shot for having roles in climate change. I don't hope we get there, but we have to really think about what's coming. The whole dimension of how do we organize ourselves, our societies, our companies, our economics relates also to how do you organize transitions, sustainability transitions. There's a whole dimension. And then I focus really on the science and the engineering in my work with the technology. Is like, what are the things that work? And I will show some examples of the Netherlands can easily deal with 5 meter sea level rise through technology, which makes me very sad that is possible, right? Because then you get a perverse kind of protective attitude and we can build our fortress mentality, but it's a very important dimension to look at. And then, of course, what we're here for is the question of how religion plays a role in all of this. And then it's in climate change, it's in also the question of how do we relate to nature, materialism, ecology 1, 2, 3. That's all sitting in here, and that all has to feed in. If you try to advise, let's say, politicians on this is the climate system from the population growth to the impacts, it's not just, let's say, what your models say. It's this whole plethora of dimensions that you need to feed into your advice. And another interesting question is, of course, and I'm not a reductionist in that sense, but I've worked a lot on extending models towards humans, extending models towards decision making. how much of people and religion can you also put in your integrated assessment models? And I'm very skeptical about that. But there is a question of how far can you come in terms of a scientific study also of the role of religion. So this is just to show you the table of contents of that book. It's available, UCL Press, open access. I'm a big fan of open access. I was able to swap a Zygon journal to open access. That is my I said I was going to do it. After a few years, it was successful. It came out in November 23. November 24, there was a book panel discussion at the AAR with Whitney Bauman, challenging in terms of, oh, you'd have to link this to new materialism. Lisa Sideris, challenging, like, you have to not only speak about wonder as it is for scientists, but also for other people. And so it will come out in the next few weeks, my response and their papers in Zygon. The book symposium editor wanted it to have there. But so I developed a whole philosophical framework. But here you can see I have a whole part, which is about the theme of this conference. Themes in science and religion applied to climate science and politics. So I invite you to take a look. One of the things I looked at was the role of poetics, both in science as well as, and then with the question, in a sense, is there really, due to science, a religious disenchantment of nature? And then following Latour is like, no, of course not. That's just the wrong image of science. So it's stupid, but of course it has a major role. So you can really use what you, and I also made the claim that Latour is making very useful contributions to science and religion, which hasn't really in that field of science and religion been taken up enough. So I think there's lots of things that can be used. Including discussions on poetics, where Latour is very careful and actually himself he is this network thinker where science has all these links to all these different entities, but he's downplaying the role, I think, of poetics and cultural entities also as resources in your scientific practice, which is, as a counterpart, I used a fantastic book which is titled The Poetic Structure of the World by Fernand Hallin. I really recommend you to have a look at that. And then in that specific chapter on poetics, I interacted with Alistair McGrath and Lisa Sideris to really think through the question, in a sense, how can you relate ecology? This is not the scientific ecology. This is the larger, more vague kind of notion of more the philosophical, theological term. How can you relate how we deal with the natural world, in a sense? How can you relate that to modern myths based on just science? And I'm very critical of that. So you have this, will just an evolutionary narrative help us? I don't think it will, but I still am very interested in the attempts. So it's about values and it's about uncertainty, and I'll come back a few times on that. So I've worked a lot on studying uncertainties in science, and I've moved more to the question of values in science and outside of science. And one of the triggers for that has been when I was asked by the Dutch government to help the government deal with uncertainty in environmental decision making. This was also after the sound science debate in the US, where I think they came very close in Congress to decide that in the 90s, no environmental decision or regulation was allowed anymore in the United States if any model was used in making that decision. Anybody here who knows about how environmental science works knows that's bogus. Even in measurements, you use models. So you have to use models in science. Okay, they came very close to that really weird discussion. And of course, as everything happens in the US, it comes to the Netherlands. Everything. So also this debate was very, very strong in the Netherlands in 1999. A huge outcry and affair that, oh, but these environmental scientists are telling us how we need to reduce our acidifying emissions, our greenhouse gas emissions, but they don't measure anything, they just model it. So that whole debate came up, and then I was asked, that was my main job from 2001 in the Dutch government, and I worked for 13 years. How do you deal with uncertainties in models in making decisions? In the government, in the parliament, also, and it was extended to European Parliament, European Commission, and the United Nations, UNEP. So that was a really fantastic time. And I worked with Silvio Vintervies and Jerry Raffets. I brought them in, because the Dutch government was asking me, you will develop now a protocol how we do that, and you will tell the scientists how it works, and they can just do the uncertainties. And I was like, yes, you can have techniques to deal with uncertainties, but you have to deal with the high stakes. You cannot just engineer your way out with applied science. You have to apply a problem-solving strategy with Silvio Vantovich and Jerry Raffet's call post-normal science. And well, I can go on for hours and hours about that. This was one of the outcomes, is the philosophical underpinning of the IPCC scenarios approach. So Bert de Vries, in my group at the PBL, Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency, was a major driver behind the way the world is making scenarios for the future. And this specific kind of set of scenarios came out in 2000, and there's a follow-up later one. And what we worked on together was an underlying paper of the methodology of building these scenarios, how you connect it with values. So we were already thinking about values, worldviews, scenarios. And these are these IPCC scenarios. I will not really go into them, but there's these two axes, like is there going to be, till the end of the 21st century, more globalization or more fragmentation? And is there a larger orientation on fairness and nature, or a larger orientation on efficiency, in a sense, more economics oriented or more nature oriented? And I looked at that paper yesterday. What did I say about religion? Nothing, except for the kind of the worst possible world, right? So the only place where I said something about this is a typical thing for the 2000s, said anything about religion, was this fortress world logic, A2, where we just have additional coal burning, right? As much as we can, and we heat the planet quite a bit, 5-6 degrees. And like the Netherlands, we are prepared to raise our dikes 5 meters, no problem, we can do that. And then we said, yeah, there's also some beauty in that world. It has a lot to offer, blah, 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 because especially to those who cherish traditional and religious values, it's like, I am ashamed. I'm seriously ashamed of what I wrote here in 2009. And Mike had the same reaction. We both did, he edited the book and I contributed to it on the history of the IPCC. So we chatted yesterday, he couldn't make it, like we really have to come out clean. So we're going to produce a little piece on especially the IPCC and religion, and also our own role in it. So let me first address the uncertainty dimension here. So we have the values dimension, which is important, but the uncertainty dimension is fascinating, and I worked most of my time on that originally, now moving more to the values. So Bruno Latour, in his early works, has this beautiful book about laboratory life and then science in action. Where he has this image of, we always look at these textbooks and science advisors, they bring ready-made science to the decision makers. But the more interesting and more important thing to look at in order to really understand what science is and how it works is the science in the making. And that's science in action. And there's a diagram here of that. This is from his We've Never Been Modern book from the early 90s. Where you have this idea that there is this beautiful distinction between nature and people, but that's just a result of a purification process. What's actually happening is our works of translation and hybrid networks here below. And I would say my kind of, in that chapter 6 on poetics, I go along with Latour, who says we shouldn't have this old image of nature, which is this one, but we should have a new, calls it nature 2, a new image of nature, which is kind of encapsulating the whole of the picture here. And then for science, if you look at how science is done, and you can see here that this whole difference in philosophy of science between the context of discovery and context of justification kind of disappears. So let me say something about the science first, and how I gradually moved from looking at the science and the uncertainties to the values. So, by coincidence, it ended up with 3 doctorates. It was never the plan, and I'm done with doctorates, right? It was an administrative error. I was appointed as a postdoc in the university, and then they said, it was in the Netherlands, can we tell the board of the university that you're also a PhD student? Fine. So I write a book and you give me another PhD or not. That's how it happened. And the last one, I will not explain that one, but that was kind of a similar thing. So this was my science basis, studying the atmospheric boundary layer, using the Dutch supercomputer. That was really useful. But then my philosophy professor, I'd done 2 masters before, called me back and said, you have to now I wanted to do a postdoc on atmospheric chemistry in Harvard. I said, no, you have to come to Amsterdam to write the philosophy of science book on the role of the computer in the natural sciences. So that's what I made the turn. I wrote that book. So this was really deepening the question of the uncertainties, right? So it's really about the role of uncertainties in the natural sciences. Case study, climate science, but also another case study. How does this translate into how the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change writes about it, and how do governments then think about it? And this is then the latest edition where I move away from, let's say, the pure science uncertainties more to all the other values. So the IPCC, I will just show you 3 iconic graphs from the IPCC from different kind of working groups. So this is working group 1 on the physical science basis, where you have this iconic plot of, with the use of computer models, you can show that if you don't include people in your model, you won't see warming. Very simple, very basic message, very powerful. So you see the warming. This is historic warming over the past kind of 50 plus years, or no warming if you don't include the people. Now, I wrote a whole book on the question of how uncertain this all is, but it's pretty certain. Yeah, the book was about the IPCC saying in 2001, I was sitting at the table, that it is likely that most of the warming was due to humans. So they thought in 2001 only 2/3 chance. Then 2007, very likely, 95% chance. It was there in Paris. And it was there in Stockholm in 2013. It was extremely likely, 95%. So I kind of left that. We wasn't interested in how certain that part is. This is working group 2, which is really what are the reasons for concern? What are the impacts of climate change that we're seeing? And you can see there's an uncertainty about where we will end up depending on the emission scenarios. And even given the emissions, there's uncertainty about the sensitivity of the climate. But you will see that there is so much risk. I won't detail these different types of risk. There's so much risk which you can easily already reach, even I think with 1 degree, let alone 1.5 or 2. So we are doing a completely tragic thing with trying to see, well, will we stay below 1.5 or 2? We have already gone beyond where the unique and threatened systems will be gone, right? And then, of course, IPCC Working Group 3 is the emissions reductions have these beautiful ideas and plots using models like how fast do we need to go down to stay below 1 or 2. But it's all kind of, and that's not even possible because this is kind of where we seem to be heading. So it's not a nice field to be working in as an environmental scientist. I look at this also as an anthropologist, right? So I was a Dutch government delegate. I was allowed I wasn't yet a civil servant in 2001. I was allowed as a philosophical observer to the Dutch government delegation. It was a beautiful opening they gave for me to do the field work, to do that philosophy study. And what happens in the IPCC is that all the countries sit next to each other alphabetically. I was just discussing yesterday with our New Zealand colleague here that we were always sitting next to New Zealand. Hence, the Netherlands and New Zealand are always having these joint kind of things also in the UN, because the alphabet says we're sitting next to each other and we're very similar as well. That's really funny. But at the back, you have all the lobbies. The coal lobby is there as well as Greenpeace, right? And they're running around to the different delegations because the countries have more voice than the lobbies. And then you have the authors sitting there who wrote this report, thousands of pages, sit on the stage, and you have eminent chairs coming from the science. It's beautiful in a UN body that the best scientists are chairing it. And then line by line, with track changes after 100 pages of government comments, you have a few days to go through it and get the global consensus of all the countries in the world of what is the best representation of the science. And the beauty is, it has kind of worked. I can go on and on for hours. We had lots of fun all the time. This is the 2013 delegation. I had esteemed kind of responsibilities at some point. It was the Netherlands and India co-chairing a problem. There was a problem. They couldn't agree on how to write about the fact that you need to adapt less if you mitigate more. Saudi Arabia said you cannot talk about emissions reductions in the report on adaptation. This is so political, right? So we had to find a way to get to appease, but also to find other language, maybe not using the word mitigation, but saying the same thing in that report. So IPCC is this intergovernmental panel, which is really important. It has 2 kind of parents, and we get every 5, 6, 7 years a complete scientific assessment. But it's aimed at, and there's also a limitation, largely at UN governments. So there's so much work going in, and then it's largely ignored. which is another kind of sad thing. And I'm still a fan, but also a big critic. They are not able to give information to the people who really need to make the decisions. Now, finally, there's going to be a special report on cities, but that's it's a really difficult thing for them. The plenary session with 200 governments is where the decisions are made on which reports, what are the table of contents, and then you go line by line approving the summaries, and you also have procedures there. I was also, after the errors in the IPCC in 2007 report, the Dutch government asked me in the agency to lead a group of people to find all other errors in the IPCC report. This was a little bit of a weird populist moment in the Dutch politics. We have one again. And then I had 3 months in the end to go through 8 chapters with 30 people full time to find as many errors as we could find. And we cleared the IPCC of any of those errors affecting main conclusions. But we also suggested improvements in the procedures because we found many sloppy sentences which could be improved. 3 working groups, already mentioned them. So now, climate, I can be really brief on IPCC and religion. Because Mike was correct, I checked and I had independently come to this conclusion. This is the only text in thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of pages produced in 6 rounds of IPCC assessment reports on the role of religion in climate change. So let me read it. So religion could play an important role, and this is focused on the reduction of emissions. I have found a separate sentence on adaptation. It could play an important role in enabling collective action on climate mitigation by providing cultural interpretations of change, and institutional responses that provide resources and infrastructure to sustain collective actions. Bit instrumental, but okay. This is policy oriented. Religion can be an important cultural resource towards sustainability at individual, community, and institutional levels, providing leverage points for inner transformations towards sustainability. Normative interpretations of climate change for and from religious communities are found in nearly every geography. This is all based on scientific literature, right? So this is all assessment on the basis of what you guys are publishing. So that's then summarized in this. This is all you end up with. Are found, and they often observe popular movements for climate action drawing on religious symbols or metaphors. This suggests the value for policymakers of involving religious constituencies as significant civil society organizations in devising and delivering climate responses. So Mike and I agree this is a reasonable paragraph. And one more on adaptation, which is focused, is hidden in a chapter on climate services. And it says, adaptation needs both to be implemented locally and to be informed by larger scale policies and directions. So one strategy will not suit every location. And then people argue for a reculturing and particularizing climate discourses in order to successfully localize global and scientific meta-narrative. Climate service development combines very different types of knowledge in the social, cultural, and cultural includes then religion, right? But there's also the word religion later. Cultural and communication sciences play a decisive role in this process. And that means that science-based climate services have to become rooted in society, and the climate science community does not necessarily take the lead. This is an important warning. But it becomes part of an inter- and transdisciplinary process where politics, culture, religion, values, and so forth, become part of climate communication. So very instrumental. Maybe we can use religious imagery in communication. And finally, this is from the synthesis report. You have a graph where everything is summarized on how we can get to heaven instead of ending up in hell. They don't use those words, but it is what it is. So you have all these decision points that you make, and you see whether you can stay below 1.5 or you have a much higher temperature. What do they say about religion? Indirectly, they say, well, there's values that can be positive as a role. You have some social, cultural factors that can have a positive role. You have social barriers, including religion implicitly, that can have a negative role. That's it. That's the summary of the whole climate change problem. 5 minutes. Yes, fantastic. So I get to second mini case and then the Netherlands. So I was in this meeting where Bolivia was asking, where is Mother Earth in this report? So religion wasn't there, let alone Mother Earth, right? And they were negotiating, actually, they did it again in the Working Group 3 meeting, and I had to co-chair a meeting to get a solution for that. But here, so they had to say something about the role of Mother Earth to talk about that in the context of adapting to climate change. And the best that scientists could do, and I'm criticizing them for it, but I don't know how they could have done better, is to have a very instrumental way to talk about Mother Earth without mentioning Mother Earth. Indigenous, local, and traditional knowledge systems and practices, including indigenous peoples' holistic view of community and environment, are a major, and there we go again, resource for policymakers for adapting to climate change. But these have not been used consistently in existing adaptation efforts. This is the mode of thinking. It's instrumentalizing religion. It's instrumentalizing indigenous peoples, indigenous knowledges. And I don't have an easy solution, but it's important to think about it. Now, to conclude about the Netherlands. So I work now as the Chief Scientific Advisor to the Dutch Delta Program. The first kind of document for that was set up in 2010. It has been around for a while. We have this program. And actually a major factor of our Delta works, which is this storm flood barrier, is on the cover of the United Nations Climate Change 2014 Part B of Working Group 2. So I saw Mike show it. Like, hey, I recognize that one. That's in Rotterdam. Yeah, it is. So we are seen as a kind of an icon in terms of how you adapt to climate change. We were seen as an icon how you mitigate climate change, but we have lost that game. We were strong in the 80s and we are laggard now in Europe. And I'm really angry about that. We have 26% of the country below sea level, and we have more than 55% at risk of flooding, right? So this is a serious issue for us to think about. I was very happy. I have been fighting for it and always lost. In 2007 in Paris, I said, what is your highest estimate of global sea level rise that you can come up with, which is plausible and based on the science and publications? The author who was leading that chapter had done those publications, but didn't dare to put it in the IPCC report, even though he held the pen. It was mind-blowing to me. Only in 2021, for the first time ever, the IPCC included an upper estimate of global sea level rise, which is in the order of 2 meters by 2100. And it may easily then also be, this is for the highest emission scenario, so that's a big caveat. And then looking at all these processes which are related to accelerated melting at the Antarctic and Greenland, right? Again, that can be then 5 meters let's say before 2200. So this is why the Netherlands say we are prepared for 5 meters. But they forget that if you have 5 meters, then the next 10 meters come very soon, and we cannot deal with that. So hence, we have started to think about, okay, what if it doesn't hold? Or what can we try? So different scenarios have been developed and have been engineered. We have done the engineering calculations for protecting our country against even more than 5 meters sea level rise. Yeah? And that is here. You really try to pump out all the water because the rivers cannot flow in the sea, so you have to pump it up. And huge walls, you close off the whole coast. Or we do that, actually, we have huge walls behind the rivers in a sense, and you don't close off the entire coast. We can also advance, build a low-level lake across the large part of the coast, and then a huge dike, and then pump it out from there, so the rivers can flow naturally. Or we can go and move to Germany. We have to negotiate, but climate refugees. I wouldn't mind Germany in a sense, but okay. Final point. So I decided, as the Chief Scientific Advisor to the Dutch government on climate adaptation now, we need to have a more serious and in-depth discussion on the cultural dimensions of all this, because it's nice to get engineers to do all these calculations, but how do we relate to all of this? And we are relating then to, there's a National Science Foundation funded project in the Netherlands on climate and religion in the Netherlands. They have a large global conference in October. And I asked them to produce input for our next year's advice. So November 2026, I will give a big advice on, you have to look at religion. And one of the things they're doing is they are segregating the different parts of the Dutch population in different kind of religious connotations, how they, which religious imagery works or doesn't work with those people. So with activists, they like apocalypse. The people who are melancholic, they are dealing with grief. The denialists, they don't want to hear anything about the apocalypse, and they're more reflexive people who really are sensitive to literary, imaginative language. But they also have different ideas of what the government can do. So the government is, for activists, it is powerful but not doing enough. While the opposite side says, well, it is powerless, or it's completely incapable, or it's unreliable. So the government really has a problem with most of these narratives, and I want to do this in a way for the government to learn, seriously, more deeply learn how problematic their role is. And this is the final slide. So there is this deep cultural relationship, and the one entry point I want to find is the relationship with water that people have in the Netherlands, to then also relate it to climate change. I've tried it with ice skating, and it kind of worked. I published on the decreased frequency of the 200-kilometer skating marathon in Friesland, which is the biggest national event every X years. X years used to be every 4 years in the middle of the century. Now it's once every 20, 30 years, and it may never happen again, right? So this is a fantastic indicator. It's not particularly religion, but there's a deep cultural connection to ice skating, which I want to exploit. And this is another one in terms of the flood is coming, and it has a deep religious connotation, of course. So thank you very much for your attention.